Welcome to all of you. My name is Jenny Peace, and I am the interim university chaplain here at Tufts. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to what has become a beloved tradition here on the Tufts campus, the annual symposium in honor of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the legacy that he left us through his words, his work, and the witness that was his life. We have a wonderful program for you this evening, and wonderful programs, as we all know, don't happen on their own. They happen through the hard work of many heads and hearts and hands. And so before we begin, I want to offer some words of thanks. Thanks to President Tony Monaco for being here today and for his ongoing support of programs like this. Thanks to the members of the Planning Committee, particularly the leadership of Katrina Moore, Director of the Africana Center, and to the chaplaincy staff under the direction of our new program director, Nora Bond. Thanks to the many folks in facilities, IT, and catering and dining services who have added essential elements to this gathering. Walking right back there right now. Thank you all. Thanks for the time and the talents of students, alums, and faculty who you will hear from over the course of this evening. And thanks to the rest of you for being here, faculty, staff administrators, some community members, and students. The joy of all this planning and preparation is to see the assembled community contributing to and benefiting from what will unfold here today. And finally, I actually just want to read the list of our co-sponsors. There are 14, but I think the breadth of support that this program receives is a wonderful witness to the value that the Tufts community places on this symposium and its wider importance. So here they are: the Africana Studies, the Africana Center, the Center for the Humanities at Tufts, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Tufts Chief Diversity Officers, the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, the Division of Student Diversity and Inclusion, the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, including the Topin Bolwell Fund, the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, and the University Chaplaincy. I know we have folks here from each of these centers, departments, and offices, and I want to thank you for your support and your presence. Yes. I was thinking as I was putting this together that that's a lot of gratitude to start with, but what better way to honor the legacy of Dr. King than to start with a lot of gratitude. So now I want to introduce President Tony Monaco to offer a few opening remarks and just say that I've been so impressed in my short tenure here at Tufts with President Monaco's attention to the health and well-being of the whole Tufts community. From the Council on Diversity, which was the first major task force of his presidency, to the ongoing leadership of the university-wide Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council, President Monaco has set a tone for a culture of commitment to civic engagement and social justice. I know he takes great pride in the work of Tufts students, faculty, and alumni who tackle the pressing issues of the day through their scholarship, civic leadership, activism, and public service. Just the kinds of folks who are gathered here today. So I invite you to join me in welcoming President Monaco to the podium.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here to participate in our annual celebration of the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We celebrate not only Dr. King, but also the generation of men and women who followed him and those that came before him in fighting injustice and inequalities. Here we reaffirm our commitment to the principles of justice and equality. Dr. King's lessons and call to action are as timely now as they have ever been in the decades since his tragic death. The movement led by Dr. King and others is not over, and the approaches to fighting injustice that he pioneered remain profoundly relevant today. There is no shortage of causes that call on us for advocacy, support, and resources. They range from racial justice to the prevention of human trafficking, from equal rights to environmental justice, from disability rights to religious freedom. The list is long, reflecting our deeply intertwined identities and the complex needs of our communities and our society. While it is a sobering list, I hope we can see it as a call to action and collaboration, not a cause for despair or isolation. At the same time that we seek to make the wider world a better place, we must acknowledge the applicability of Dr. King's words to life in our own university community. Tufts was founded as an institution that would welcome and value students from every walk of life, and we have a moral responsibility to safeguard the well-being of every member of our community. To the students, your education here is not just about preparing for future jobs. That is why active citizenship is one of the core pillars of the Tufts experience. Our world needs individuals who are willing to take on causes larger than themselves or their own self-interest or professional development. We need your generation to provide the future leaders for positive change in our society. As students, you have demonstrated a commitment to active citizenship through your advocacy and your service to organizations and communities surrounding our campus and around the world. And as graduates, we expect that many of you will be drawn not only to the mission-oriented roles that are vital to your jobs, but also to our thriving communities and advancing society. So no matter what path you follow, I hope you will be an engaged member of your community. Active citizenship is needed now more than ever, given the complex challenges we face. In that spirit, thanks to all of you who volunteered in Monday's Day of Service by participating in service projects in Cambridge, and the many people who organized that effort. It is a great tradition, and it doesn't happen all by itself. I'd also like to thank all the faculty, students, and staff who worked together to plan and support this program. And thank you to our student speakers for sharing the stories we're about to hear, and our panelists for sharing your expertise and perspectives on this meaningful occasion. So in closing, because any celebration of Dr. King should in the end move us toward action as well as remembrance, I hope that today's program spurs each of us to amplify our own efforts for justice and equality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here today, and to President Monaco for those lovely words. So I want to basically introduce the Sharing Family Histories part of our program. I'm Kendra Field, a professor in history here, and also the new Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, director of the Center of Study of Race and Democracy. At last year's MLK event, this event last year, students of the powerful writer Grace Toulousan shared personal reflections on their lives and on our society in a way that I thought really introduced a new dimension, an important one, to how we think about and how we memorialize the history of movements and of social change. So today we're going to hear in a few moments from 3 students of mine who've produced really powerful family history research projects in the last semester. And these are projects that similarly engage both the personal and the political, and often in the same moment. They produce these projects in the context of a course that I teach here at Tufts on family histories and American culture, in which students practice researching and writing family history in a way that is both rigorous and creative, and that is especially attuned to the silences that so often populate our histories, including family histories, but also, I should say, movement histories, the histories of change. Before I turn it over to them, I want to say just a couple words about the nature of this work. And I should say I also write family history myself, and so this is my favorite class to teach, and I'm really excited to hear from them. So I often say that 2 emotions lie at the heart of my own family history research and of others as well: pride and shame. Pride, the stories that we tell and retell with a purpose and when it matters most, and shame, the stories that we bury, hide, erase, or never tell in the first place. So this work is about storytelling, but also about silence. It's about how and why certain details were told and remembered, and how and why others were never narrated. These sorts of hidden transcripts, as we know, form the roots of respectability politics that came to dominate African American lives, family histories, and historical narratives to varying degrees in the century and a half since emancipation in the US, including the 20th century civil rights era that we think about today. The oral versions of family stories and later movement histories often rang with pride and self-determination, often rightly so, but also pointed to a haunting underside of worry, vulnerability, and trauma that people attempted to leave behind, especially the history of racial and sexual violence. The novelist Ralph Ellison called it our unknown history. But these buried secrets and silences continue to haunt and shape our present. This unknown history includes countless stories of violence, terror, and vulnerability, stories that were erased or obscured by segregation, shame, or silence, stories that fail to conform to exceptionalist narratives of racial uplift, and stories that were not built to invoke pride. Shards and slices of lives, many of them were not stories at all. The second thing I wanted to say is that I hope that one day soon it will go without saying that when we write about family history, at its best, we are not writing about biology, blood, DNA, or 23andMe, but about kinship and attachment, about the social, political, and economic constraints of family formation and narration. So I write and rewrite into my own narratives, encourage my students to do the same, the names of non-biological relations who were not nonetheless family, but necessarily family, as well as the names of biological relations, including children born outside of legal marriages, the children of second, third, or hidden families about whom others dared not speak. So in so doing, in this class, we attempted to fill the space between the official truth of lineage, or property inheritance for that matter, and the unofficial truth of who people parented, comforted, and struggled alongside. This includes those who did not adhere to the contemporary dictates of nation, gender, class, or race, and those that have been systematically misremembered, obscured, or omitted from written records and oral tradition. As E. Francis White writes, the stories that we refuse to tell do matter. I just realized I wasn't clicking along here. Just do that. Okay, so today we're going to hear, in this order, we're going to hear from Ruthie Block. Ruthie is a junior at Tufts, majoring in English and computer science. Then we'll hear from Tiffany Cho. Tiffany is a senior at Tufts, majoring in history and economics. And then we will hear from Jessie Ryan. Jessie is a junior at Tufts, majoring in American Studies and anthropology. There's much more I could say, but I will let them share what they wish. As you can imagine, these research projects are also deeply personal ones, and I'm very proud of each of them for the tremendous intellectual as well as personal work that they invested to produce truly fascinating research. And I'm going to welcome Ruthie.
Hello. Hi. Thanks, Professor Field. All right, my name is Ruthie, as you just heard, and I'm going to read an excerpt from a family history paper I wrote about my grandfather's uncle, Willie Madison. And the bulk of this paper deals with Black land tenure and the relationship between labor and land as it evolved in the late Reconstruction South. And my story sort of follows Willie as he reimagines that labor as a cattle driver and a Colorado Steelworks employee and a union striker, and then it eventually follows him back to Texas during the Great Depression, starting with his adolescence on the family farm as purchased by his formerly enslaved parents in 1875 in the now disappeared town of Sprinkle, Texas. So I'm going to start with a note on family source. Here we go. I would not have found my way to Willie's story if not for the jewelry box my mom gave me last year. It's dark and wooden and altogether plain if not for the glossy photographic lid. A ceramic tile with an image of our family's farm in Sprinkle printed on top. Up until this gift, I had overheard phone calls about lawyers and land and had visited the family gravesite in Austin for funerals and upkeep. I'd heard inklings of a farm but knew nothing about it. I'd never seen it and couldn't name anyone from the generation that would have been alive to operate it. On the box, printed in reddish ink, I saw the entire house and I saw the soil it sat on. I think the 5 kids are staring at the camera, although their eyes are difficult to make out. The Longhorns are staring too. The trees are bare and spindly, and the tallest child wears a vest and a shirt and long trousers. It must be winter. There's something sort of horrible about holding a photograph of your family and not knowing a single name. And so I reached out to my cousin for answers about the faces and the land and the home. She directed me towards an online collection of family artifacts and digitized memories. There are hundreds of photos like the one on the box. A folder titled Needs to be Identified is full of them. Most are similarly brownish and vague. I wanted more, and she directed me towards a document entitled Madison Family History via Collins Genealogy. She wasn't sure who wrote it or where exactly it came from, but she assured me it was worth looking at. All right, I'm going to fast forward to the section after all of Willie's journeys, where he returns to Texas during the Great Depression. He arrived home to a crumbling town. The buildings looked the same, but only around the edges. The faces were different, and everything was half there. The grocery looked like he remembered it, but the men's clothing store up top, the one with the wide brim hats and the leather saddles, had been reduced to 3 or 4 bricks, laying bare in heaps of dust. Texas was dry and splitting. The sky felt lower than it did when he was a kid. While Willie was away, the MKT Railroad had arrived, bringing 4 trains per day. They passed through town, stopping to pick up cotton from its 1/8-mile-long loading platform. But cotton wasn't what it had been when he left. World War I had tanked the price of the crop, and the Great Depression had brought farming to a near halt entirely. His neighbors, kids from the church his own age, now should have been well into their 50s. And yet the town bore few familiar names. Typhoid fever and the draft had decimated entire families. The church itself, the one his mother had dragged him to on Sunday mornings, had burned down. Sprinkle had dried up. The remaining residents moved to metropolitan centers such as Austin to find work. Billy and his wife, Minnie, must have walked through a town of bricks and newsletters, 4 miles from Walnut Creek, back to the family farm. And I'm going to read my conclusion. Billy and Minnie did what the rest of Sprinkle did. They bought a nice 3-bedroom home in central Austin. They lived alone at 908 Olive Street. Billy's brother, D. Collins, was the primary tenant of the farm during the Depression. He moved back to take care of the farm, to tend to the family left behind after the death of eldest brother Van, and to raise his own children in the area. Maybe he took strolls to D. Collins' florist shop, Madison Florist, the first and only black florist in Austin at the time. DC was said to walk 10 miles to Austin, Texas on the weekend to be with his family, refusing to use mules for his trip because he felt they needed the rest. I like to imagine D walking to Austin to visit Billy and Minnie, and bringing his 2 sons with him on foot. I've been trying to figure out why he and Minnie owned a 3-bedroom house. They had no children, and by the time they'd moved onto Olive Street, they had to have known they never would have had any of their own. And so I like to imagine that those rooms were filled by D. Collins and his 2 sons, Shannon and Thomas. Shannon was the older of the 2. I picture him as a teenager, sitting by Billy's side as he told stories of the lost Sprinkle, Texas, and the wild blizzards of the West. I picture him telling his nephews the same things his father had told him. Education and ownership of land will set you free. And maybe, in that 3-bedroom house, owned by him and him alone, telling his own stories about the land that made him, Willie was free. Or maybe not. Willie died in 1953 at age 72 in Austin. He was survived by his wife. He passed away of heart failure. His occupation, listed on the death certificate, reads laborer. Shannon, my grandfather, died in 2013. And I was there when it happened, and I was there when we buried him too. Shannon and Tom and Ophelia and Thomas B. and D. Collins and most of the other Madisons are all buried together on the land where the Methodist Episcopal Church stood before the fire. Willie was buried at Oakwood Cemetery. I'm not sure why he ended up somewhere else. I'm not sure how he covered so much land just to come back home, and how after it all he was buried 9 miles away from the rest of his family. I don't remember much about my grandfather. For the majority of my life, he wasn't really there. He had severe dementia, and I never took the time to understand most of what he had to say. I remember him humming, and I'm sorry I never really asked for the words. Maybe these were Willie's songs, songs from boyhood about the West, songs from campfires, union strikes, and songs from the farm. I struggle, in retracing Willie's story, to write something that resembles a conclusion. It feels wrong, selfish to try and fold his life up into a tidy narrative of found freedom despite the injuries of Black life in late Reconstruction South. It appeals too closely to the logics of linear generational success that wiped Willie's life out of my family's history in the first place. I do not want to adhere to these logics, the logics that lost him. Again, I do not know if he felt free, and I cannot claim to, but what I do know is that Willie's life of labor and possession, of soil and violence, is one within the chorus of many. Maybe he, like so many other Black and forgotten figures, aspired to a selfhood he was never granted. Willie's is a history of mourning and groaning, of trying to work a way out of no way. And so I conclude only that there is a success in the remembrance of his ambition in trying. There is a success in that someone cared enough about him to record his name, to record 3 sentences about his work and his journey and his death. There is a success in that these seeds within my family's own historical project were ever planted. And I celebrate that, although I wish I had more of him. Still, what I do have is extraordinary. I have the family record, the unidentified photos, and the traces Willie left behind, and census records, and employee IDs. And through the eyes in the reddish photograph on the jewelry box, and through the paths I follow him down, the Sprinkle Town Center, the cattle drives of Goodnight Loving, the Pueblo straight lines of Colorado, I have pieces of Willie I never thought I would. I see him work, and I see him fight, and I see him leave. I see him come home again. Through my grandfather, I hear him. I celebrate him. The success is a Black memory. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, I'm Tiffany, and today I'm going to be reading you the opening section of my paper, which is about Japanese colonialism in Taiwan. For the first 15 years of my life, I took pride in being a Chou. The Chou, or Zhou dynasty, is one of China's most prosperous founding dynasty, and I was proud to be associated with such a powerful lineage. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that Chou isn't my real last name, and perhaps more unfortunately, that I probably will never be able to figure out what my last name actually is. The point of this project isn't about me nor my identity, but in order to truly explore and flesh out my genealogy, I find that it is necessary to first unpack the reason why I chose to focus on my mother's side of the family instead of that of my father's, and all that is correlated to my hard-sought yet fruitless search for my enigmatic last name. The relationship between my parents had always been rocky and tumultuous, delicate and fragile at best. Their marriage was one that was plagued with dishonesty, infidelity, and violence. I spent the first 15 years of my life serving as the buffer between them, the mediator that oversaw their countless divorces. I remember the many nights that I would be pulled out of my bed. Both of them would spew hate at one another and try to convince me that the other person is doing whatever they were doing because they didn't care enough about me nor my sister, because we simply weren't enough for them. As a result, my older sister was sent away to a boarding school in the US at the tender age of 11, something that I both pitied and envied her for. I never understood why my father would treat my mother and I like that, and I also never comprehended why my mother always went back to him. All that partially came to light when my father passed away in 2013, when I was 15 years old. After much probing, my mother finally came clean and told me that my father's inability to commit to a marriage, and to a family even, may be due to the fact that he had a tumultuous childhood himself, although to me, it sounded more like her own justification for excusing his behaviors. My paternal grandmother was never home. My paternal grandfather was a judge and was always busy at work. My father thus took on the responsibility of taking care of his 4 siblings at a young age. One day, my father got into a physical fight with some of the boys at his elementary school. He was injured, lost a lot of blood, and was quickly rushed to the hospital. My grandfather was the first to show up, ready to donate blood to assist his eldest son in any way he could. Imagine his surprise when he was told that he couldn't. He had type B blood and my father had type A. My father eventually received blood from others and his wound healed. However, the lingering question about his parentage stayed with him, just like the scars that he had received from the wounds on his knees that day. My grandmother had type O blood. It is genetically impossible for someone with type O and another with type B to produce an offspring with type A. My father tried to bring up and inquire the identity of his biological father, but whenever he did, my grandmother would become evasive. No one in the family ever truly acknowledged this, even though everyone was fully aware of it. It became an unspoken agreement, the dirty secret of the Chou family, as one could say. When my father and his siblings reached adulthood, my father was the first to succeed. He married my mother, his high school sweetheart, moved out of the house, and started his own company. He achieved overnight success, and his once elusive and absent mother suddenly became a constant in his life. When my father passed away from a heart attack, my grandmother stayed in touch with us. Only after a few months did we realize that her sole reason for doing so was due to potential financial gains that she believed she could have. She, along with my father's siblings, believed that my father left a sum of money behind. After providing for them for about a year, my mother informed them that she could no longer financially support them, as she still had to put me through college. This led to a number of legal court battles, and as a result, my mother and I are no longer in touch with them today. Thus, although finding out the identity of my biological grandfather has been a mission of mine for the past 7 years, it sadly is something that I would have to set aside for now. And instead of focusing on figuring out the paternal branch of my genealogy, I'm choosing to focus on the other side, the side that actually raised and nurtured me. So once I've decided to focus my attention on the maternal side of the family, it became obvious who should take the center stage for my project. One thing I can clearly recall from my childhood is that I could never understand my grandparents, in the sense that I could never communicate with them. This wasn't due to any cultural or generational gap, nor was it because I was particularly difficult or a rebellious child. It was simply because we didn't speak the same language. My grandparents spoke Japanese and Taiwanese, and I speak English and Mandarin. Seeing that my mother speaks Mandarin and Taiwanese, a fortunate overlap, she acted as a translator in all my interaction with my grandparents. I had always wondered why, despite being Taiwanese, my grandparents didn't know any Mandarin. Mandarin is, after all, the official language of Taiwan. The answer came to light when I entered elementary school and was taught the history of Taiwan. So my mother's side of the family is from the tiny island of Magong, and Magong is one of the 90 islands in the Penghu archipelago. And Penghu itself is is off the coast of Taiwan, another island of its own. 9 generations ago, my ancestors left Henan, China, in search for a better life. They first traveled to Fujian, a busy port of Qing Dynasty China, and then from there took a boat to the Kingman Island. Their time there was brief and filled with hardship, so they were quickly on the move again. This time they traveled further and came across Penghu, the archipelago of Taiwan. According to the plaques found in the Chen family temple, the year was most likely 1640. The original Chen found a tiny inhabited inlet and started building houses and infrastructure there, utilizing dead coral reefs and rocks found along the coastline as the foundation of their houses. They named their inlet Anshan, and members of the original clan settled down and formed families there. One of the first children born in Anshan was Zhen Shuang, and Shuang was the first ancestor of mine that I could positively identify, and he was also part of the first generation born on that new land. He was born in 1670, and Shuang went on to father 3 sons and an unknown number of girls and firmly established a family in the region. So fast forward a lot. Prior to working on this project, I had always wondered why, despite living through the Japanese colonization, most Taiwanese people then and today still hold the Japanese in such high regards. Using individuals such as my grandparents as a segue to explore larger historical contexts, I was able to get a better sense of why this dichotomy exists. The backbone of this project, the photographs, oral history, written records, and family trees, provided me with a medium to interact with my grandparents in a much more intimate way. Through the process, I was able to contextualize the stories that I had heard growing up, and thereby gained a deeper understanding and appreciation for my own family. Through a deep dive into the lives of Chen and Runu, my grandparents, I grasped how the gaps in records and the silence that results from that often illuminate subtleties which reveal far greater than the abundance of records do. Now, 3 months and 21 pages later, I feel that a barrier has been removed between us, and that I can finally understand them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessie. Thank you, Tiffany and Ruthie. Those are really beautiful. I'll be sharing an excerpt of my family histories paper, which traced the life of my great-grandmother, Margaret Nin Kahn, who helped raise my dad. My research into Nin's life started with her father, German-Jewish immigrant turned successful New York City banker Otto Kahn. The first 3 sections of my paper, Who Was Otto Kahn?, Anti-Semitism and Assimilation, and In the Archive, explore Nin's life as the daughter of 2 German Jews in America at the turn of the 20th century. This was a time in America where anti-Semitism and anti-German sentiments were rampant, and so as I started to research Nin's life, her story quickly emerged as one of assimilation. Despite her ostensibly normal family and childhood, 2 parents, 3 siblings, a house in the suburbs, there was more to the Khan family story than what appeared on the surface. When she was 10 years old, Nin and all 3 of her siblings were baptized in an Episcopal church in Morristown, New Jersey. While this, too, may seem like just another facet of suburban American family life, the event of Nin's baptism, when taken in the context of her German Jewish parents and heritage, serves as a window into the complex story of immigration and assimilation that she represents. Indeed, thousands of Jewish families immigrating to the United States around the same time as the Khans were forced to make difficult choices about faith and family that would affect generations to come. In the last section of my paper, Reconstructing Kin, I attempt to reconcile with the difficult choices Otto and Nin made. I'll share that section now. Like most people, my relationship with my family is complicated. I never knew Nin because she died before I was born. I also never really knew her son, my paternal grandfather, though I met him many times. Unlike the generations that came before them, after Otto and Nin's generations, my dad's family started to unravel. The remnants of Otto's fortune that Nin left to my dad's father fueled a New York City socialite lifestyle, which eventually enabled drug addiction and alcoholism in both of my dad's parents. Because of this, my dad grew up in a largely parentless household, albeit one where drugs and money abounded. During his junior year of high school at Milton Academy in Milton, Massachusetts, my dad was kicked out because his parents opted to drain his tuition money on their drug habits. Returning to New York after this, it was only a matter of time until my dad developed an addiction of his own and spent the following 5 years of his life homeless, using, and in and out of rehab. By the time my dad got clean at the age of 23, he was ready to leave the pain and trauma of his childhood behind completely, and for a long time he did. Because of all this, I did this project for my dad, who's here today. Dad, you taught me what it looks like to love in the face of fear and pain. I wrote this paper to show you where that came from. With that, telling Nin's story in this paper feels important not despite the painful reality of my dad's family life, but because of it. While structurally, maybe the story of Nin's life is one of assimilation and erasure, a more phenomenological approach to her life, one that centers her lived experience and the conscious intention that went into each turn of her development as a person, reveals that more than anything, her story is about love. Her father chose to baptize her as a mechanism of protection from violence and discrimination. Nin's assimilation in this case, then, is a story of both violence and of love. Understanding and coming to terms with this kind of contradiction in reconstructing Nin's life was difficult, but this project helped me to reframe these contradictions as integral pieces of my family story rather than confusing notes in the margins. There's a Jewish prayer, Asher Yatzar, "Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who formed man with wisdom and created within him many openings and many hollows." I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Before this project and still now, my family history is full of holes and hollows. Alcoholism, drug addiction, estrangement, bad record keeping, and myriad other circumstances I'll never know made this so. Not only that, but the anti-Semitic assimilationist forces that worked to destroy the longevity and legacy of Jewish families partook in the making of these hollows too. Before I started this project, I didn't know anything about Nin Khan. I didn't know that she, like me, also had an older sister with whom she spent so much of her time. I didn't know that she liked to dance. I didn't know that she was born Jewish or that she became a product of the American Assimilation Project. Her story was one of the hollows. But the Asher Yatzar thanks God for creating empty spaces, gaps within man. In Judaism, to contain such openings is a blessed sign of wholeness. While it has been full of pain and trauma for my dad for most of his life, my dad's heritage is what makes him and what makes me whole. And while much of Nin's life still remains obscured to me, while there are still holes in her story, I accept that our hollows are what make us who we are. In his book Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell writes that our family histories ground us all, quote, "in a web of advantages or inheritances, some earned, some not, some deserved, some just plain lucky, but all critical to making us who we are." So what did I inherit from Nin, and what pieces of her life didn't make their way down to mine? While perhaps obvious, much of what I didn't inherit from Nin has to do with Judaism. While certainly the faith itself, the rootedness in tradition, kinship, and love that accompany Jewish culture were also lost on the family line over the course of her life. This, too, is a goal of the American Assimilation Project. It is not meant to act only on the individual, but in turn on their every descendant. However, where faith and tradition serve as powerful modes of kin-making, this is a tie I do not want to leave severed. In an attempt to reconstruct a kind of kinship with Nin, I want to honor the hollow in her life and in my family where Judaism once dwelled. For the past few months, this has looked like holding weekly Shabbat in community with my Jewish friends, which feels like a small way of reconnecting with and honoring the life that Otto Kahn lived and the life he gave to his third eldest daughter. I will never know everything about my dad's family, about Otto or Nin's life. I cannot heal my dad's pain around his family, and I cannot rid myself of the pain of simply not knowing so much about what makes us who we are. Instead, this paper has been an attempt to reconstruct not only Nin's life, but the connections my dad and I both have to her too. Before this project, what I saw in place of Nin's story in my family tree was simply a gap, a dark and empty space. This paper has been an attempt to reframe that dark hollow as an opening, to go into it and to turn on the lights. And as the Jewish teaching goes, a little bit of light dispels a lot of darkness. Thank you.
What a wonderful way to start our evening together. I want to just give all three of our student speakers another round of applause. It's amazing. So now we are going to have a light supper, and I invite all of you to self-organize into lines in the back. There are 2 buffet tables with the exact same things on both tables. There's halal and kosher options. So help yourselves to a meal. We will have about half an hour before we regather ourselves and begin the panel discussion. Thank you.
So our panel discussion on the theme of On the Right Side of the World Revolution, Local Movements and Global Visions includes Dr. Seth Markle, class of 2000, Hope Wallensack, class of 2011, and Desmond Fonseca, class of 2020 this year. It also includes our wonderful facilitator, moderator, Dr. Carrie Greenwich. So I'm going to introduce Professor Greenwich, and then I'm going to turn it over to her, and she will introduce our panelists. Dr. Carrie Greenwich is the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, which was published by Norton Press this fall. The book is a biography of African-American activist William Monroe Trotter, and it explores the history of racial thought and African-American political radicalism in New England, and specifically Boston, at the turn of the 20th century. It was named by the New York Times critics as one of the top books of 2019, and received incredible reviews in the New Yorker and in the Times as well. Greenwich currently directs American Studies at Tufts Department of Studies in Racialism and Diaspora, and is co-director of the African American Trail Project. If you'd like maps, I think we have some back there, maps of the African American Trail Project, which maps about 240 sites across Massachusetts. Greenwich received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University. Her previous work includes historical research for the Wiley Blackwell Anthology of African American Literature, the Oxford African American Studies Center, and PBS. For 9 years, she worked as a historian for Boston African American National Historical Site, through which she published her first book, Boston Abolitionists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrie Greenwich.
So I think our speakers can come up to the stage while I talk. I just want to reiterate again that all of the students who spoke and did their family histories was really beautiful. So I applaud you. It was a good introduction to our event. And I wanted, as everyone's getting seated, I wanted to just start by saying, kind of giving a little bit of connecting the first part of the program to the second part of the program. And I want to start by saying history is important. Scholarship is important. As we use this day to celebrate, commemorate, and reflect on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we must listen to our panel of wonderful speakers, fully cognizant of the importance of historical context. We must remember, for instance, that the title of our symposium, On the Right Side of World Revolution, comes from King's speech at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination in Memphis. Entitled Beyond Vietnam, A Tide to Break Silence, King's speech in Riverside Church was widely criticized by his self-professed liberal allies, including President Lyndon Johnson and NAACP leader Ralph Bunche. The New York Times stated that King's connection between social justice in the United States and the country's military-industrial project in Vietnam was too radical. Linking these hard, complex problems, the Times said, will lead not to solutions, but to deeper confusion. Although King privately expressed his, quote, socialistic leanings in letters to his wife during the 1950s, the Beyond Vietnam speech was the first public expression of anti-war human rights transnational vision that scholar Cornel West calls King's, quote, unrestrained and unapologetic radicalism. This is why history and scholarship are important. At a time when everyone from Jeff Sessions to the FBI can celebrate the King holiday in bland tweets and apolitical perfunctory acknowledgments, we must remember that the FBI mercilessly tried to drive King to suicide during its decades of surveillance. We must also remember that Jeff Sessions' appointment to the Supreme Court in the 1980s was defeated by Coretta Scott King and other activists labeled, quote, civil rights extremists by the Reagan administration. In remembering that King is not the moderate, fair play integrationist that conservatives have co-opted for everything from gun rights to racialized gerrymandering, we must also remember that a Black historian, steeped in the Black radical tradition, wrote Beyond Vietnam. Vincent Harding was a veteran who received his doctorate in history from the University of Chicago in 1965. His seminal text on African-American history, There is a River, was one of the first to place African-American history in an African and transnational context. Harding wrote many of King's speeches, including the words that unite us here today. This history is important because it forces us to resist turning King into a hashtag, or mistaking social justice activism for an ahistorical, apolitical endeavor divorced from the intellectual traditions from which such activism emerges. And so, I'd like to introduce our speakers today with an eye toward our historical context and the history with which they are to engage. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce them now, and I will open up at the end after everyone speaks to questions and comments from everyone in the audience. I'm getting old, so I'm going to take out my glasses because I cannot see. So we are going to start with Desmond Fonseca, class of 2020. Desmond Fonseca is a graduating senior double majoring in history and Africana studies. His research interests broadly revolve around anti-colonial, Pan-African, and Black radical thought and practice during the Cold War. Currently, Desmond is writing his senior honors thesis on anti-colonial and anti-imperial solidarity organizing between Angola and Black America in the 1970s, amidst the guerrilla struggle within and decolonization of Portugal's African colonies. He has been awarded the John Lewis Humanity in Action Fellowship, the Laidlaw Scholarship, and was a scholar at the Schomburg Mellon Summer Humanities Institute in New York City. Beyond the classroom, Desmond has been involved in pro-labor, anti-imperial, and anti-Zionist organizing at Tufts, as well as during his study abroad at Oxford. So we'll start with Desmond. Yes. Okay. And then I will... Thank you so much, Professor Greenwich. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Do I know? No. It's green. It's on now? Okay. So everybody can hear me. I wasn't looking when I asked the first time. Okay, I can hear myself in the reverb too. So yeah, thank you, Professor Greenwich. Thank you, Professor Field, and Katrina for inviting me to even participate in this panel next to these two wonderful speakers who I'm very excited to learn from. Very excited to have a conversation with y'all in the audience about the legacy of Dr. King, about being on the right side of world revolution, as he said in the Beyond Vietnam speech. And in preparing for this presentation,
I was wondering what like a 21-year-old undergrad could have to say about Martin Luther King that hasn't already been said, because so many people have said so many things, right things and incorrect things, about the legacy of Dr. King. And I guess following what Professor Greenwich is saying, I want to first and foremost say that the Martin Luther King Jr. that I carry with me like day in and day out was obviously an anti-racist, but he was also unabashedly anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, especially in the last 2 years of his life, which proved to be so dangerous that he had to be assassinated. And that Martin Luther King was not one that was given to me, but that had to be learned or unlearned. Through my U.S. American education, whether that came through schooling, the media, or politicians, I was taught to believe that Martin Luther King Jr. was merely an anti-racist Baptist preacher. And taught to believe that he was so successful as an anti-racist Baptist preacher during the heyday of his civil rights organizing that we don't need to be anti-racist anymore, and that we have overcome. I think it's safe to say that we in this room know that this is an absurdity, but it's an absurdity which has become the public face of a man so feared by the white American majority and the U.S. government that he was assassinated by agents of both, in my humble opinion. But recently, I felt a resurgence in the popular memory of King's legacy and his radicalism to the point that I've seen my dad, who is a pragmatic, down-ballot Black Democrat, listening to an audiobook of Cornel West's The Radical King. And I think the fact that we are convening on a symposium, talking about Martin Luther King, talking about revolution, shows that to be true. And so in this talk, I'm going to continue to invoke the legacy and radicalism of Dr. King continuously, referring back to him, in combination with my own research interests and current thesis writing, which you heard about. But beginning with a little bit of the personal, which brings me to my political writing. And so neither of my parents had migrated to the United States by the time Martin Luther King was assassinated. But that doesn't mean that their lives and struggles were not always already entangled across the Black diaspora and Pan-African world. My father was born in Cape Verde, an archipelago nation off the coast of Senegal, which famed historian Walter Rodney has called the first slave-trading entrepot of the modern colonial world. And my mother was born in Angola, which I'll be speaking more about. In Professor Field's family history class, I actually explored the politics of Cape Verdean nationhood and diaspora through my family's migration from anti-colonial Africa to Boston in the midst of the anti-busing riots of the mid-1970s, in 1976 specifically, which is also the year that I focus on this episode of Angolan Solidarity, reading some excerpts from my thesis writing. So yeah, Angola is the subject at hand today and is one which brings me to a more direct connection with Dr. King's legacy and the trajectory of world revolution. So to speak about my family, on both sides, I have an inherited history of anti-colonialism, which from an early age was an entry to my thinking about questions of Black and Third World liberation. My uncle was a member of Amilcar Cabral's National Liberation Movement, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, or the PAIGC, for which he was arrested and tortured by the Portuguese government. On my mother's side, her adopted father was a guerrilla commander and Minister of Defense of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, which is known as the MPLA. And both men met and revered Fidel Castro. So like the U.S. inundation of like anti-communism is a barrier that I've barely had to hurdle in my trajectory of scholarship. And so more specifically to my thesis, I'm currently working on a senior honors thesis which is focused on the African Liberation Solidarity Movement in the 1970s, where I focus on Angolan decolonization. And from 1961 to 1975, the Angolan people, led by 3 national liberation movements, were engaged in a war against the Portuguese state. And unlike in other colonies, it was like beset by internal factionalization between the party that my family is actually a part of, the MPLA, and 2 others, UNITA and FNLA, which would eventually be aided, financed, and collaborated with the U.S. and apartheid South Africa, as well as the People's Republic of China, very interestingly, where the MPLA had alliances with the Soviet Union and Cuba, which now brings me to Dr. Martin Luther King. But by 1976, which is primarily the years I'm going to be talking about, Angola was independent, nominally, officially. At this point, it had been less than a decade since Dr. King was assassinated, yet his legacy was already a powerful one, particularly with the invocation of the same speech which the symposium draws its title from. So at this point in 1976, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War had officially ended, but anti-war and Black liberation activists feared the outbreak of what they called another Vietnam in Angola through the increase of U.S. involvement in the conflict between these Angolan nationalist groups. The fact of the U.S. interventionism in Angola became clear in the later months of 1975 as the mainstream and Black press reported on the U.S. funneling of arms to oppositional factions supported by apartheid South Africa, as well as the training of CIA-backed mercenaries to be sent to fight in the African country. But by the early months of 1976, the Angola crisis, I argue in my thesis, was the focal point of Black radical imagination, with Black organizers striving to situate themselves on the right side of world revolution. And this meant opposing U.S. imperialism, as King decided it did in 1967, against the advice of some of his closest collaborators. And so in February, there's a specific Black Solidarity or Angolan Solidarity rally, which is held, organized by the Black Panther Party. And it was organized to also counter Henry Kissinger's, Henry Kissinger, who was then one of Richard Nixon or Gerald Ford's close advisors in San Francisco, and he was seen as a singularly antagonistic figure for Black anti-imperialists across the country for his role not only in starting and intensifying the Vietnam War, but his well-publicized and then declassified study and policy report on Southern Africa, where he and the Nixon administration advocated for a close collaboration with the regime in apartheid South Africa to stop the spread of communism in the region. And so the parallels between Vietnam and Angola were so remarkable at the time that the Panthers and their fellow organizers opened their solidarity rally by actually playing audio clips from Martin Luther King's anti-war speeches throughout 1967, 1968. So there, hundreds of Californians bared the freezing cold and likely heard the voice of the slain preacher utter the same phrase which we are convening around today, that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. And of that radical revolution of values, King declared that, much like today, it will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterments of the countries, and say, this is not just. That's the radical revolution of values would say. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. And so those exact same words could and should be uttered today as they were in 1967 regarding Vietnam, and as they were repeated in 1976 regarding Angola. And they also likely heard King repeat one of the many refrains he utilized during his anti-war speeches from 1967 until his death. That's, the Western nations which inherited so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. King himself, throughout his life, struggled to ensure that he was on the right side of world revolution, as I've been repeating. I personally doubt that at the same time, I personally doubt that the Marxist-Leninist Black Panther Party would have replayed King's specific critiques of communism, but they did discuss his clear anti-capitalism at that February 4th rally, a critique which holds incredible weight to this day. King declared in the later months of 1967 that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad. And so in one sentence, Dr. King was able to make anti-racism, anti-capitalism, and anti-imperialism a local and global necessity. And this message was similar to a refrain of the era that I've been researching, American solidarity with African liberation in the Portuguese colonies. But Dr. King drew regular criticism for his regular attempt to mix civil rights with his anti-war message. But in the last year of his life, he maintained that he was going to keep these issues mixed because they are mixed. Issues in the US, issues beyond the US. And in that regard, I think the beauty of Martin Luther King is not in his exceptionalism to Black radical politics, but his role within it. He's not an exceptional case, but he follows the trajectory of what Professor Greenwich is saying. He's very much steeped in the Black radical tradition, but we don't think of him as being so. And knowing this history, I've come to understand that organizations like the Black Panthers, or individuals like Dr. King, Malcolm X, Elaine Brown, or Assata Shakur do not exist in antagonism to each other, but within a larger project which is guided by a sense of love and a yearning for liberation, not just for Black people, but for all of the oppressed and wretched of the earth. And so these internationalist Black radicals poked and prodded with each other over strategies to liberation, yes, but the best of them were unrelenting in their commitment to eliminating what Dr. King called the triple evils of global and US-based racism, militarism, and materialism. And so stressing the shared commitment across the trajectories of Black radicalism has become very important to me in my own research, especially because I've been seriously grappling with the schisms of Black radicalism in specific relation to the Angola crisis. While Martin Luther King was certainly an anti-capitalist, he was no communist, despite the FBI's attempts to destroy him as such. And while he never veered into a destructive anti-communism, or what he called negative anti-communism, which is the same logic which destroyed an earlier era of Black organizers and excommunicated figures like Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, and Claudia Jones, his anti-Vietnam War speeches often contain anti-Soviet and anti-communist China sentiment, the same fear-mongering which we see day in and day out in the mainstream media today. And so this brings me back to Angola in my research, because in the 1970s, perceptions and realities of Soviet and Cuban interventionism in Angola caused fierce divisions in the US between anti and pro-Soviet black radicals. It's a very confusing story for me still to unravel today, as to do with factionalism and all these things. But they struggled to come to a consensus over which liberation movement to support in the former Portuguese colony, as they also did in South Africa. And one group was supported by Russia and Cuba, espousing the politics of multiracial socialism, and generally received the support of the Black Panthers and Black Communists, that's the MPLA, while the other group was newly discovered to be receiving secret assistance from the US and apartheid South Africa, and for a time was generally supported by Maoist, Black Power, Black nationalist figures. And so during that February 1976 Angola Solidarity rally in San Francisco, Elaine Brown declared that Angola was not a black and white issue, and evoked the name of Martin Luther King Jr. in saying that imperialists like Henry Kissinger used poor people, black, white, Chicano, and Native American people as pawns in their anti-revolutionary schemes. Brown denounced the black people. At the same time, she denounced the black people who have a tendency to get involved in nationalistic fantasies about what is black and what is white, and furthermore, that we cannot be fooled by color. In particular, Elaine Brown and many other black radicals of the time denounced the plan of Roy Innis, who was then the director of CORE, to send black Vietnam veterans as mercenaries to fight on behalf of the anti-communist and US-backed forces in Angola. And to Innis, she specifically said that people are dying every day in Harlem of gunshot wounds by police, of hunger and disease. If he is so concerned, then he should involve himself in his immediate area, and that will have a tremendous effect on the people of Angola. To repeat these two statements by Elaine Brown, then the chairperson of the Black Panther Party, is not necessarily an endorsement of her philosophy, but to show two things related to the theme of this panel. First, that to be on the right side of world revolution is no easy victory and comes through rigorous struggle and intense ideological and political conflict between people dedicated to the cause of liberation. And to be on the right side of world revolution is not always popular and rarely easy, nor is it a clear or singular position to come to. In Dr. King's analysis, to be on the right side of world revolution does require a commitment to anti-racism, anti-materialism, and anti-militarism. But how to get there, how to develop a clear line there is a struggle. Developments in black thought and action since then have shown that it is also fundamentally anti-patriarchal and anti-cis-heterosexist. But secondly, Brown's speech at that Angolan Solidarity rally highlights that there are things we can do and things we must do right here in the United States, whether that be in the ghettos, towards the prisons, or on the former plantations to challenge American imperialism. And I have no idea where to conclude this, but I am concluding. But today in our Gale Fellows class, our Gale Fellows meeting, our first one of the year, we watched an impromptu documentary of John Henrik Clark's documentary. And I guess this is me trying to say that I'm still working on this research. I plan on attending grad school to get my PhD and do the same research that I'm doing now. But Arturo Schomburg said to John Henrik Clark in the documentary that before you begin to know your own history, learn the history of your masters and of your enslavers. And that's kind of the mindset that I have as I'm going into a PhD and entering the academy, entering the world of academia, which is complicit in the trajectory of injustice that we see continue to this day and for the past 400 years. And I do want to conclude with a quote from one of Dr. King's last speeches to emphasize his continued radical relevance today, which is that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And he said that 40 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I tend to be very loud, so I apologize if this bursts people's ears. But thank you very much, Desmond. We have questions. We'll get to our next speaker, Hope Wallensack. Hi. Hello. Hope Wallensack was most recently the Senior Policy and Advocacy Lead at Fair Fight Action, where she led research and advocacy strategy for inclusive democracy policies and voter protection in Georgia. Hope has spent nearly a decade in organizing, justice, and advocacy work, and Hope's career is grounded in her upbringing in New Haven, Connecticut, and her early professional experiences as a teacher and assistant principal in New Orleans, Louisiana. These contexts provide a critical lens for understanding systematic injustice and strategies for leveraging change. In 2011, Hope graduated Tufts with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and minor in Africa in the New World. In 2018, she graduated from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School with a master's in public policy. Hope is currently the director of research at Overcoming Racism, leading equity in consulting with clients in politics and education.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you. Wow, these are tough acts to follow. These students are amazing. So I'm very glad to be back at Tufts. Thank you for that warm introduction. I am Hope Wolensack. I graduated here in 2011. And when I think about King's legacy, I think about the applicability to the work that is going on today in the South predominantly, particularly around voting rights, and how his legacy really impacts that work and the work that I've done for almost a decade down there. So if you asked me when I graduated 9 years ago, would I be the policy and advocacy leading voting protection efforts across 20 states and democratic reform efforts, I would have never imagined I would have been in this position. I certainly was definitely interested in organizing, as Katrina will let you know. I did a lot of campus organizing, but I never thought that it would lead me down this road. So I spent a lot of time majored in political science, minored in what was then called Africa in the New World, did a lot of organizing around Africana studies and getting a major that eventually has become a department, which I'm so excited to hear. And even more excited to see the amazing work that's coming out of that department and the amazing voice it's giving to students and faculty, really warms my heart. So I'm really glad to be back. Went into education, was doing a lot of organizing around education against the carceral state in New Orleans, Louisiana, went to graduate school, and immediately afterwards was like, what is the fight right now, and where is the place where I can have the most impact? And I could think of no better place than working for this little-known, well, I knew her, but at the time, not very well-known politician in Georgia who was House Minority Leader of the Georgia State Legislature, Stacey Abrams. I had been following her trajectory for some time. I knew she had started this massive voter registration project. I knew she was talking about, wait, Georgia's actually a blue state? Wait, we have mass voter disenfranchisement, and that's why we're not seeing the political power that we should? And she was really moving and organizing. So I graduate, I'm on the campaign. Worked on the campaign for about 6 months, organizing voters, doing outreach to what we would call unconventional voters, so basically people who for generations, the traditional political system has said, they're not gonna come out to vote, they're an unlikely voter, I'm not gonna focus my time, effort, resources, or my message really on getting those people to turn out. So we spent a lot of time in communities that were so-called unconventional. What we saw is that if you talk to people, they do turn out. If you speak directly to issues that are facing their communities, they do turn out. When you include them in the political system and respect them in the political process as if they are members of this process and not as if it's charity, they will turn out. And you really have to speak to people where they are. And what we saw was incredible turnout, historic turnout. Stacey Abrams and I will say our team got more votes than any other Democrat in Georgia ever, more votes than Hillary Clinton. And you have to think presidential year turnout is very high. There were more total votes for Stacey Abrams. But of course, probably many folks know this story, so I will tell a very abbreviated version. We essentially lost by 50,000 votes, almost the exact margin where that would not trigger a runoff. We were a couple thousand votes short of a runoff. The day of the election, I was at various polling locations ensuring that things were going according to plan, and I saw personally dozens of voters turned away. That following morning, got up at 7 a.m. We're still in this race because votes are still being counted. And myself, along with other members of the team, about a dozen of us, we received, in addition to actually probably hundreds of volunteers, received over 10,000 phone calls of voters who had experienced issues and whose votes were not counted. Now, those are the people who called in. Imagine the number of people who didn't call in didn't even know they had really experienced a problem. When they were turned away, they thought that was right, whose registration had been rejected previously, who weren't even on the rolls to vote in the first place because they had been purged. So we received 10,000 calls. We immediately started documenting their stories. I didn't know how to write a declaration or a sworn affidavit. It's a legal document. I learned in about an hour. Started collecting all of these folks' stories, started figuring out we actually need to be documenting what's happening because real time, an election was stolen. And enough has been stolen from us over time. This is not just gonna go by as if it didn't happen. Began documenting those stories, and many through calling in, but then eventually by doing actual field work. So we started, myself and 2 other colleagues, started traveling across the state of Georgia to counties where we maybe hadn't heard of stories yet, but we knew voter suppression had occurred. We had looked at the data, we looked at provisional ballot rates, we looked at a few other indicators, and we were like, turnout in one county versus another, areas where polling locations had been closed, people have experienced voter suppression here. How do we actually find those people, and are they willing to talk to us? Driving across the state and documenting these stories. In the end, we accumulated over 400 stories that then became part of a federal lawsuit right now against the Secretary of State's office, essentially, thank you. Which eventually we hope will have implications that ripple across the country for what it means for voting rights. That lawsuit from November, from the non-concession speech that Stacey gave, from that November until, we first filed the lawsuit in that November, and then most recently, there's a court date coming up in May. If you know anything about federal legislation, or federal litigation, an 18-month turnaround on such a massive case with so much evidence is almost unheard of. The urgency is really behind the fact we have elections happening all of the time, and those elections have really serious repercussions for people on the ground. So when I think about King's legacy and the work that I have most recently been doing around voting rights and inclusive democracy, I really think about the ways in which obviously the fight still continues, but the ways in which the sanitized version of history, the lack of intersectionality, actually really does a disservice to the movements that are going on today, and how movements today, activists, organizers, what have you, people interested in politics, volunteers, whoever it is, we really need to have a deep understanding of how we got to the point where we're at, because it's the only way, through that analysis, is the only way we can begin to fix these problems. It is the only way we can begin to do something about it. It's the only way that we can tell a clear and coherent story and know that we're advocating for the right type of change when that moment occurs, and be ready for it. A big piece of this was just explaining the narrative of voter suppression. And you would be surprised the number of people who, in Georgia and across the country, who just didn't understand the historical implications of what was around polling, around poll closures, around this policy called exact match, around many of the policies that were keeping folks disenfranchised and what it meant on a personal level. Many folks who didn't understand systematic voter suppression versus what they might label as personal responsibility to make sure you know your polling location, you know that you're registered, that type of thing. And so when I think about my experience here at Tufts, it really, in many experiences I then had after, but certainly here, in the classes I took here, Race in America, African American history up to 1865 and post-1865, these were the classes that I was drawing upon, and the things that I had learned, this vocabulary that so many people have expressed, that I was drawing upon to help actually give that narrative real time in the moment. And I couldn't be more grateful for having that voice and having those experiences in that moment, because it actually really shaped a very real movement. Now Fair Fight is operating across 20 states, right? There's a very clear there's a very clear narrative that people understand, that is accessible, that Fair Fight is fundraising off of, because that is a necessary part of it too. And so I really reflect on my experiences here. I'm happy to share more about I think I'm going a little long, so I'm gonna stop. But certainly, like many of the stories of Martin Luther King, and many other actually activists and organizers who I don't think are as well known, and many other movements, whether that's the Montgomery bus boycott and the deep history around that, have inspired my work. And so I'm happy to answer any questions or elaborate on any point about both Fair Fight, but also what inspires this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Introduce our next speaker, Dr. Seth Markle. Dr. Markle joined Trinity College's Department of History and International Studies program in 2009. He earned his BA with honors from Tufts University in African Studies and English in 2000. In 2011, he received his PhD in history from New York University. He is the author of a wonderful book, A Motorcycle on Hell Run, Tanzania, Black Power, and the Uncertain Future of Pan-Africanism, 1964 to 1974. He is currently working on 2 separate multimodal projects about hip-hop culture in Tanzania and Hartford. Markle's courses on Africa and the African diaspora are taught through an interdisciplinary lens with emphasis on the critical interrogation of personal memoirs, oral histories, film, fiction, photography, and music. In an effort to challenge the prevailing negative stereotypes and myths still associated with the peoples and cultures of the African continent, Markle seeks to impress upon his students the multi-layered dimensions of African agency and Africa's historical contributions to the making of the modern world. Professor Markle also serves as the director of the International Studies, coordinator of the International Studies program's Africa concentration, and interdisciplinary minor in African Studies, faculty advisor to Trinity's International Hip Hop Festival, and Posse Scholar Mentor. So please join me in welcome.
Wow, thank you very much to all the organizers, and to be back here. I think the last time I was here was maybe 4 years ago for another alumni symposium. So to come back again, it's always great just because of the importance of the Tufts space for me. And so like my fellow panelists, I want to talk a little bit about that. But I'm first going to talk about the book that was mentioned, A Motorcycle on Hell Run. It's not about a motorcycle. It's not about motorcycles. People have asked me that before. I said, no. It's a story about African Americans and Caribbean activists and intellectuals, radicals, who were inspired by world revolution, inspired by what was happening in the late 60s and 70s, particularly with the decolonization in Africa and the emergence of independent nation states. This had a profound impact on African Americans who historically have been thinking about nationalism, nation statehood. Do we create our own nation state in the United States? Do we leave and form a nation state like Liberia or Sierra Leone? Or do we stay and integrate, right? How do we be in a place where there's a worldwide white supremacy? How do we live? How do we exercise our collective and individual agency? And so in a lot of ways, I look at people like, well, I'm a Malcolm X guy. I mean, I know this is MLK Day, but I mean, I'm gonna be honest. I'm trying to really be honest with myself. When I was in college, I really didn't care about King, just based on my politics. I read him, obviously, and I knew he was a great man, but I responded in all the research that I do now and what I was doing in undergrad here at Tufts was a response to an historical narrative where it's just about King. You would think that King was alive during slavery, you know, just how much they reduce 100 years of struggle to a single individual. And so for me, growing up here in America in an education system where I was denied Black history, I came to Tufts with this desire to know more about African American history, African history in particular, and particularly about resistance, because the King narrative for me, I was just like, okay, I got it, but I know there's more. And so I write about people like, and then also I kind of grew up in the 90s. This is like Malcolm X, Denzel Washington movies, Spike Lee, hip hop was talking about Malcolm all the time, a lot more than Martin. So I was really into Malcolm's life. I read Malcolm before I read King. But nevertheless, King always kind of appears in this history, and he's very, very important. But I just want to say that and trying to be really, really honest. Because, and in my book, I kind of say that, for King, when he's talking about local and global, yes, King was very local in talking about things globally. And yes, he traveled abroad in the late 50s, but he didn't really travel abroad after that, not as much. But you had a whole bunch of people who did, particularly young people in the 60s and 70s who were kind of responding to civil rights, the nonviolent approach, the passive resistance approach, and were starting to call for black power. And that meant revolutionary violence, that meant coalition building, that meant building black institutions, but that also meant solidarity with all these other revolutions taking place in Asia, Latin America, and particularly Africa. And so I follow a set of African-American men, women, who traveled to Tanzania, who were inspired by its socialist project, its Pan-Africanist identity. Tanzania was supporting Angola and the liberation struggles happening in southern and central Africa. It was this citadel of black radicalism for the 60s and 70s. And I was interested in particularly people like Malcolm X. And I found out that Malcolm X went to Tanzania. And then through that, I found out that all these other people went to Tanzania. And so I followed these people, starting with Malcolm, in trying to build relationships and connections with the Tanzanian government and its leaders, political parties, revolutionaries. I go on to look at Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, people like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and others, and what they were doing internationally, particularly with Tanzania. And then I go and follow a Caribbean Marxist by the name of Walter Rodney, which Desmond mentioned, and how he worked at the University of Dar es Salaam and was working through education. Then I talk about a book publishing company out of Washington, D.C., Howard University students, former Howard University SNCC students, who created a book publishing company called Drum and Spear, and how they tried to set up a publishing company in Tanzania, publishing Pan-Africanist literature. And then I end with looking at the ways in which a group of African Americans organized an international African solidarity conference known as the Sixth Pan-African Congress in 1974. So over a 10-year period, I'm interested in questions of why Tanzania. How did you participate in nation building? How did you find your role? What was that power dynamic? Because these people represented largely organizations or were non-governmental officials working with government officials and party people. But these were the kind of questions that I try to ask in following this 10-year story. And a lot of that is rooted in my Tufts experience from 96 to 2000. Like I said, I came very interested in Black history, and so much so that that's all I really wanted to do. I kind of majored in 5 professors. One of them is here now, Professor Robinson, Professor Gill, Professor Sharp in English, Madam Roy, and just was taking Black studies courses. And once you immerse yourself in Black studies, Africana studies, it shapes you in a way where it's not only giving you this type of knowledge of Black history and Black resistance, but it's also kind of introducing you to a tradition of Black radicalism as an intellectual. Everybody that I was encountering were not only intellectuals, but they were activists. They were trying to put the theory into practice, and that's what we did at Tufts. It was a great launching pad. We had an enemy, the institution, overdefined. For us, it was the institution, and we organized a lot on this campus, and a lot of what we were doing as Black students and the people that I was, in the movement that I was a part of on this campus, we were just reading stuff and trying to implement it. So we were really informed by SNCC and what they were doing as students, going into the communities off campus, and we went into communities off campus in Somerville and Medford, and we met people. We met a former Black Panther from Medford who became a mentor to us, and he taught a course here in, I forgot what it was called. It was like alternative courses. I don't know, EPIC? No. X-College, yeah. X-College on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he just really told stories about what it was like being a student in the South, doing nonviolent direct action, voter registration. But then he also became a Black Panther back in the 1968. And so being exposed to both professors through hardcore, tough love mentorship. Professor Robinson mentioned the story. I always mention this story, but I came to Professor Robinson in 1999 after studying abroad in Ghana. And when I was in Ghana, I saw an African-American community there. And I wrote an undergraduate thesis about the African Americans living there in 1998 and 1999. Now, I didn't collect any research when I studied abroad there. I just kind of came back. I met with Professor Robinson and said, I have this idea. I want to write about these African Americans in Ghana. She's like, what do you got? And I was like, I got the idea. And she kicked me out of her office. It's a true story. She kicked me out of her office and said, I don't got time, don't waste my time. You need to get yourself back to Ghana. And I was like, okay. And so I did that. I went back to Ghana in the summer and did all these interviews about African Americans there. I learned about the history going back to the 50s, King going there in 57, Du Bois and others, people that you probably haven't heard of. But it was that experience here at Tufts, that mentorship, taking all of these courses. I do oral history. I took Professor Gill in history. I took his civil rights seminar. And what I really enjoyed about that was that it was an oral history seminar. We had to interview family members. We had to interview civil rights activists. And I interviewed this person I was telling you about, George Davis, who was a Black Panther. And when I interviewed him, he drove me around the city of Boston, took me to Roxbury, and just drove me around Roxbury telling me about the history of kind of Black power in Boston. And it was not, I don't remember everything from that interview. I just remember really enjoying the stories, really enjoying recording people's stories, really enjoying having them share their stories with me. And so you have both a combination of the mentorship, the exposure to classes, and this interest in history, but also these other subjects, because Black studies is interdisciplinary, that really kind of shaped this question that I would have about the ways in which African Americans try to participate in world revolutions, to try to act globally and think globally at the same time. People that are in movement internationally and traveling to places, people that are being influenced by ideas coming out of different places beyond the United States, whether it's from China or Cuba or Ghana, Tanzania. These were the questions that started to really sort of percolate when I was an undergraduate, in combination with trying to be an activist. I come out of the battle in Seattle, the anti-globalization movement, the major protests that were happening at the DNC as well as Republican national conventions along with Seattle, as well as coming out of what would be the political prisoner movement. In college at Tufts, and then after college, I stayed here in Boston. We worked in a broader student of color coalition around freeing political prisoners and raising awareness about mass incarceration. We worked in the prisons here in Boston, both in the women's prisons and the men's prisons. But again, that's just kind of speaking to this need to try to do stuff, not just read. Try to kind of combine what I'm getting in these books to trying to put it down in my everyday life as far as being an activist, at the same time being a scholar.
So thank you very much to all of our panelists. And I know that many students were saying that they want a chance to ask questions, so I will make sure that we have enough time. But I'm going to ask you just a couple of questions to kind of open up our discussion with everybody. And I thought I would start with, given the first part of our program, in which students were talking about, beautiful discussions of history, but through the lens of family history. I wonder if each of you can comment about how your own family experiences, your own pasts, you think, have led you to both your scholarship and then your role as an activist and your role as somebody in the world.
I said it already.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But you talk a lot about, just talking to you personally about growing up in Boston and having your parents' history, but what is it that you see specifically about that history that has made you kind of take the mode of inquiry that you're taking?
Mm-hmm. I guess bringing it closer to me, divorced from my uncle, my grandfather. My father, and I wrote the family histories paper in Professor Field's class about my dad coming to the U.S. In 1976, coming to Boston, and coming to Dorchester in 1976, being bused. So he moved to Dorchester, which is a primarily Black neighborhood, and was bused to a school in South Boston with him and his four youngest siblings. He came within a family of 13. him and actually his younger brothers just remember taking the bus and just being pelted with rocks. And like, what kind of an experience is it to come from Cape Verde, which is like considered like a Creole, like multiracial nation, where people, or at least my family says, we don't think of ourselves in terms of race, we think of ourselves in terms of class, which I can push back on, but still like the vastly different world that they came into, where they were being labeled as black and they themselves didn't think of themselves as black. They thought of Senegalese people or Guinean people to the east coast of them as black, and they thought of themselves as mixed. To just be thrown in like the situation of the United States, and just completely have your own personal conception like thrown out of the window when you walk out onto the street and you're trying to get to your grandparents' house and people are chasing you down the street and throwing rocks at you. I think. And then going back to like, right? Woo.
Yeah, I know.
And also like the casualness, which he says it, he's like, yeah, I used to walk to my grandmother's house and these Irish boys would like throw rocks at me and I had to run, and it was. And then to also think about how that affects me. I mean, like how I grew up and the fact that he wanted me to grow up in. He didn't want me to grow up in Boston. He had a really bad experience growing up in Boston, the rough parts of Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan that he grew up in. And that he brought me to a public school in South Shore, Massachusetts, which is predominantly white, which very much changed my conception of how I thought about race, how I thought of myself as a black person, as the son of immigrants. And so very early on, I was thinking about race kind of from like an exclusionary perspective, thinking about the ways in which that I was ostracized in public school. But the fact that I was brought to a white public school with my dad, who had a deep desire to leave the city and go to the suburbs, has to do with how he was brought up in both Cape Verde and in the United States. And also thinking about why he even came to the United States in the first place is because of the intense poverty that he faced in Cape Verde as a result of centuries of colonialism by the Portuguese, which was aided by the United States for decades. And he wouldn't have came to the United States, he wouldn't have thought the United States was the land of milk and honey if Cape Verde wasn't what it was for decades. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
So my family history is really kind of a history of opposites. I am biracial. Both sides of my family have been in the United States for at least, one side of my family has been in the United States for at least like 400 years, and the other has been here for about 300 years. My father is white, and my father is white, and my mother is African American. And my father's side of the family, there is a very well-traced lineage that goes all the way back to the Mayflower. On the other hand, on my mother's side of the family, my mom is an orphan. And so we know a little bit about where her lineage comes from based on her last name and a few other aspects. But she was a dark-skinned little girl growing up in the 1950s and 1960s outside of Nashville, Tennessee, in a place that had both no running water and no electricity for most of her childhood. And so when I think about, I hold this real tension around what it means to be able to trace your family history on one side all the way back to the Mayflower. Also reconciling what that means about some of my ancestors and some of the things that they did. And then on the other side, I really predominantly grew up and lived this reality as a black woman from a pretty low-income community. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, not affiliated with Yale in any way. We just live there. We live on Winchester Ave, which, if you know, is we literally live on Winchester Ave. So I really hold this tension. And then when I bring that to my work, and largely grew up just with my mom, and I'm one of six as well. I'm the youngest of six. All of us which like visually represent, usually visually people take us in as just being African American or certainly a person of color. I've never in my life been mistaken for like, oh, you must be half white. You can have this privilege. So although there are some historical aspects that of course come with it. And so when that comes, as it's applied to my work, thinking about where my mom comes from and carrying her story with me, thinking about the things I went through, the schools I attended. I was never really taught how to write a formal paper, as some of my professors who are here might attest to. It was a struggle that like did not set me up for success in life. I've seen that in my 5 siblings who deal with systems every single day. So when I'm engaging with either the education system, when I was an assistant principal, when I'm protesting against the carceral state, when I'm fighting for voting rights, it's not some abstract concept for some community separate than my own. 9 times out of 10, it's been an issue that either I personally faced and I personally sometimes struggle with, or that someone very, very close to me has struggled with this issue as well. So not being able to trace my mom's side of the family back, I really think about it I don't have the luxury, right? It's not just about her lineage, it's about all of us. These are my people, this is my fight, and if I'm not engaging in this fight, there is no one who's gonna do it for me. And it won't be given to me, it's going to have to be done through a fight. And I'm here and I'm ready to do that. It can be exhausting, it can be tiring, there are days when I'm worn out, and even I have questions about what does that mean for me as an individual in terms of being burnt out. But that too much has been done for me to give up now. And so really that history of opposites really informs how I go forward, and really seeing two very different sides of my family history.
Thank you. Very beautiful. Thank you.
My family is really complicated, but I'm learning now in the last 2 years of doing family history. So I'll just relay one story that I think speaks to what you're asking about, this notion of kind of learning from history and your family history and how that kind of shapes your worldview and what you do. I'm learning that, my family ties on my father's side go back to Trinity, Alabama. And then you had the Great Migration, and he didn't go very far. He went up to Louisville, Kentucky, and ended there. So a lot of my stuff is Louisville and Alabama. But then, in doing this history, I found out something about my great-great-grandmother, who was a white woman from Virginia. And she fell in love with my great-great-grandfather, black man, who was also from Virginia. And they had a child together, and that was against the law. And the family of my grandmother, great-great-grandmother, was put in an insane asylum for being in love with a black man. And she was put in an insane asylum in Georgia. And they had a child together, and that child was put up for adoption and adopted by a family from Trinity, Alabama. So in learning that story, it just sort of speaks to how, you learn about racial injustice in this country as an historian, and you hear all these terrifying stories, but to not really have it in my immediate family, but then to learn about it, that it is something that, people in my family going back to the late 1800s were experiencing and having to go through, an effect that there's this interracial element to it, right, where that was something that you couldn't do. You couldn't be in an interracial relationship. Kind of speaks to the longevity or how long this struggle is. I think that's kind of what it did for me. It's it didn't necessarily personalize it so much because these people are still unknown to me. I don't have any pictures or anything like that. Just that story, nevertheless, kind of inspires you in a way to keep trying to make a contribution to the Black freedom struggle and understanding that it is historically rooted. And that's what I got from that little story about my family history.
Thank you so much. It was very, very beautiful. And thank you all for sharing stuff. Before I open it up, I had a question. I know before this, everyone was saying the big question, but I'm going to throw it out there. How does your historical study, your engagement with activism, your current career, how is this informing your approach to our current political moment? And that seems like it would be self-evident, but it kind of is getting at, I know a lot of students come, particularly last semester, were coming in and saying things like, I'm really interested in this form of study, but I'm so overwhelmed by what's just happening in the world, and so my form of study has no impact, right? I feel kind of like I'm just going to my classes and I'm doing this thing, but it's going to have no impact, and they're really overwhelmed. So I was wondering if Steve, you could speak to that notion of how it is that your work, your activism, your scholarship, the way that you're living your life informed by your experience at Tufts, how that is interacting with our current political moment.
I can also start. We can keep it going.
Keep the order going.
Left to
Poor
right,
Desmond
I
is like,
suppose.
yes.
No, but I guess first answering how I situate my own academic trajectory. Obviously, I don't have a professional career yet. If anyone wants to hire me, just kidding, don't. But I think my historical study combined with like me thinking about like my own academic trajectory does actually, like what Professor Greenwich says, it's very like anxiety-inducing from one perspective. Doing the historical research that I do, the Black Studies research that I do, I have so much admiration for people who were my age in the 60s and 70s in SNCC, and were literally changing the world. Literally changing the world to the fact that we still talk about these people today. Like I mean, they are legends and heroes, but people in SNCC were 21 years old like I am. Fred Hampton was not even a college student in the Chicago Black Panther Party. He's 22, 23 years old when he was assassinated by the FBI. Like, how much work do you have to do by the time you're 22 years old to be assassinated by the FBI? Because you are a threat to the security of because you are considered a threat to the security of the United States of America. And then here I am, I just feel like I'm, like exactly what you're saying, I feel like I'm 21 years old and just in classes. While wars are happening across the Middle East, while Donald Trump is elected president. And also, even bring back to Dr. Martin Luther King, he wrote a letter to a 20-year-old Angolan nationalist who was studying in Brazil, instructing her how to straight up just like liberate her country from Portuguese colonial rule, Deolinda Rodrigues. My grandfather actually knew. And on the flip side of that, I think I also get a lot of inspiration in this contemporary age of like the resurgence of fascism which never went away, a fascism which was represented by Donald Trump in the United States, by Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Because studying Black radicals like Dr. King, like Fred Hampton, like Claudia Jones, like George Jackson, like Angela Davis shows you that this isn't new, that Donald Trump presidency isn't new, that the ideas that fuel white supremacy, white reaction, hyper-capitalism is not new, and that people have thought about the solutions, or that people have thought about the practices and actions that we can do to counter them. And that's what gives me hope, and that's what keeps me studying, keeps me in school.
Thank you very much. Yes.
No, go please.
So I went to graduate school I taught and I was in education for 5 years in New Orleans, Louisiana. I went to graduate school. I was like, after this, I'm gonna try to get a job in the administration. I'm out of this organizing stuff. We're out of this. I graduated in 2018 with a master's in public policy, and of course, Donald Trump was elected. There's no job in the administration for me. So obviously found my way and found my route. I balance a lot, like this continual fight and looking at kind of these like brutal facts on the ground and trying to still hold some optimism. Of course, my name is a lot of pressure, so I try to live up to the optimism. Can't be mopey with this name. But certainly it's a struggle in the work in the work that I do. When you think about particularly in democracy policy and voting rights policy, like voter disenfranchisement is one aspect, but we have like hacking of voting machines, like Russian interference. We have these actually like mega forces at play, and so sometimes when it's like fighting against voter purges that's going to affect 10,000 voters in a state, that is incredibly important, but I'm well aware of these like larger forces that keep folks disenfranchised, or that basically kind of like run the game for us, and we could go down that list for a really long time. And so when I think about this work and in trying to think about how a specific field or a specific area of study is relevant, I think like it takes all of us chipping away at this little by little in whatever field that we're in. So there was a quote I recently read that's like, you are both not responsible for completing the work, but nor are you entitled to abandon it. So like, I don't have to carry this entire load on my shoulders. You don't have to carry this entire load, but we are also not entitled to leave it to someone else. And so when we all are participating in a way, no matter what the field is, science, like math, computer programming, like all of these various fields, change actually comes from this concerted effort from multiple people on multiple fronts with different skill sets, with different points of view, with different insights, making this change happen. One of the most powerful stories to me is the story of the inception of the Montgomery bus boycott. It actually goes back to a woman named Ruthie Taylor, who, long story short, was sexually assaulted outside of Montgomery, Alabama. Her story and her experience, and the NAACP field investigator who was sent to investigate her story, Rosa Parks, was a young Rosa Parks at the time, was the launching pad for what was one of the most successful organizing efforts, one could argue, in the civil rights movement and potentially throughout history. And all of that really dated, and all of that was because of the concerted effort of many people over a long time doing the work and waking up every day ready to do it. When I think about the 381 days of the Montgomery bus boycott, I think about, day one, you're feeling real good, you got your shoes on, maybe you don't feel too good, I don't know. Day 20, day 30, day 100, day 365. You've been at this for a year. Day 380, right? Like, you never actually know when it is just around the corner, and when by every single person participating in it and doing it and trying to hold that optimism, you can actually create this really massive change. So I try to hold that story in moments, and for everyone, like, your story might look different. That story is really personal to me, but everybody might hold a different story, a different experience, something else that really, like, gets them up every day, gets them doing the work, gets them, like, feeling like I'm not in this alone, and there are other people also carrying this with me, and I wake up every day for them because they rely on me to do this work.
Thank you very much.
For me, as an historian of civil rights, Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, I tend to look at this current political moment from that historical lens. You'll find a lot of similarities, and that's insightful, just so much in the sense that it doesn't necessarily make our current moment here in the United States necessarily unique. And I asked that to people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like, was this what it like when Nixon was, president? Is this how you guys were feeling? Like a lot of anxiety and fear? And some people say, oh yeah, that was there. And so I think history helps, historical lens, because you find that there's a lot of things from the 60s and 70s happening during that world revolution moment that we see happening today on a world scale. We're still talking about imperialism, although we use the language of globalization. We're still talking about pro-democracy movements that are happening all over the world, Africa, Latin America, all throughout the global south, right? Same thing that was happening 40, 50 years ago in the 60s and 70s. Those pro-democracy movements emerging. The rise of authoritarianism and fascism, right? These things were happening as well, with African independence and this whole idea of what happened to some of these African governments with the leadership. I remember giving a lecture in Intro to African History, and I was talking about some of the dictators of Africa, and a student tentatively was like, sounds a lot like Trump. I'm like, there you have it, right? And the student making that sort of connection with this idea of how we look at authoritarian rule, and that's something that is, again, a very insightful lens to have, because these things were happening in the 60s and 70s. And then when you're looking at movement building, in Black Lives Matter movement and other grassroots organizations in the US and abroad, engaged in this kind of organizing that we see happening in the 60s and 70s on a very grassroots level, this challenging or this belief that electoral politics is important, but not necessarily the end or the means through which we receive an end or a liberation. There has to be that advocacy that comes from the community. These things are all very relevant today when we're thinking about how we want to respond to this moment. But understanding that the moment is not unique in the sense that we're not just talking about what's happening in the US. One of the things that you see, or at least from my opinion, that we see different from the Black Power civil rights moment to today is that international solidarity component. Yes, you have the rhetoric of it. Someone can tweet out, I stand with the students of Sudan, or I stand with, whatever sort of movement happening outside the United States. And that happens, and that's fleeting. But I'm talking about people in the 60s and 70s actually going beyond that. Through travel, through connection, through making that effort to make those actual concrete links with organizations and leaders on a grassroots level. I don't see that so much happening today, particularly, at least in my experience in Africa. While there are these movements and movement building happening in Africa, I don't see African American or Black organizations in the US necessarily making that effort to expand and have that global solidarity sort of ethos. And that's something that's gone away and something that we certainly need to bring back, because what's happening in the U.S. is no different than what's happening in some of these other places, especially when you're talking about Black people all over the world. So the Black Power moment provides a very important lesson. Strategies and tactics, what worked, what didn't work, especially if you're talking about protest now. I think there's a lot of things we can learn that were good and bad. We could perhaps talk more about that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for people who have questions for our panelists or about the day. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
Thank you all for your presentations and speech. My question is for Help Polendzik. I want to know more about your experience in documenting voter suppression, particularly the field work and the challenges that you faced. Were at any point you had to face threats to your own security while collecting this information, and how did you deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So particularly when it applied to the field work we were doing to collect stories and to try to document voter suppression across the state, safety was a major concern. We would typically travel in pairs, although the majority of our staff was white, and we were traveling to African American communities, because that's the reality of voter suppression in Georgia. So, also communities of color in Metro Atlanta, but that was slightly different. When we were going to rural communities, it was predominantly African American. So that meant I was going on nearly every trip, typically because there is a very real distrust of white folks, even progressive white folks, even white Democrats, however you want to label it, in rural Georgia, for many reasons, which I'm sure we all can imagine, which has a very long history. And so we were going to collect these stories, and yeah, there would sometimes be threats, or there were threats towards the organization. There were also lots of circumstances where people would share a story with us, but not want us to actually document it or release that documentation. As part of the lawsuit, your story is shared and becomes part of the public record, even though your name is redacted. Well, if you live in a county Georgia has 159 counties, which means some of these counties are incredibly small. Everyone knows one another. I mean, there are gonna be some details in this story where people are gonna know who you are, and trust me, people have gone through all 400 of those sworn declarations that we've had, and people who submitted declarations have been contacted. So we tried to take precautions on our side, but there were a lot of threats more generally towards the organization, that we should not be doing what we were doing, and then of course towards the voters themselves when they tried to basically stand up for themselves. So yeah, it was not good.
Other questions? Yes.
Again, thank you to you all. I just want to know, how is this still legal, and what are the mechanisms that allow voter suppression to still keep happening in 2020?
I can answer,
That's
and then
you,
others
right?
can
Yeah.
certainly add. Mostly it's that in most states, the Secretary of State, the state level Secretary of State, is in charge of elections. In some states, you have a state elections official who's separate. I think it's like 35 states, it's your Secretary of State, and that is a partisan official. So there are a number of mechanisms that they can use or policies that they can enact. And what they often cite is the Voting Rights Act, and that they're in compliance and that they must have these policies in accordance with the Voting Rights Act. In all honesty, the policy is separate from like the legislation. The legislation on the books does not require that states uphold things like exact match. Exact match is a policy that says if your driver's license doesn't match your voter registration exactly, you cannot vote. So let's say you have a hyphenated last name. Let's say you have a name where sometimes there's a space, sometimes there's not a space in that last name. If you show up on election day, you're not going to be able to vote. Guess who that like disproportionately affects? Women, for one, who more often have hyphenated last names, but also lots of people of color, whether you're Latinx, lots of folks of color. That policy in and of itself, right, on paper doesn't seem like it would be discriminatory, but certainly an impact it is. And so we see these secretaries of states and their offices across the country enacting these policies. Then more obviously, we have things like polling location closures, reducing hours, reducing staff, not training staff, because if staff aren't, it's almost willful negligence to ensure that things will go wrong and people can't vote. And so this is how we see it happening. If we go back, it really goes back to Shelby v. Holder and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2012. And that Supreme Court case certainly has led us to exactly where we are today. And we saw that all of the states that required pre-clearance under Shelby v. Holder, like day after Shelby v. Holder that case was decided upon, all of those states enacted these extremely discriminatory policies. And what they saw was that demographics are changing. Demographics are changing seriously, whether it's not just the South, it's not just Georgia, it's across a bunch of states, Florida. And so like the nature of like the way our politics is gonna operate is gonna have to be different. And so all of these policies were really put in place almost to preempt a shift in political power.
Yes. I think just to add to that, not only with the 2012, but this generally speaking with, the fight against black voting rights began with the Voting Rights Act. Like soon as it was passed, you're talking about a 40-year history of backlash to that. The gutting of the Civil Rights Commission, the sort of how the federal government's checking the southern states and all that slowly eroding away over a 30-year period that brings us to 2012 and kind of lets these sort of politicians get away with suppressing black voters.
And in the case of Georgia, wasn't the Secretary of State the person who was now the governor? It was Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State, the person overseeing the elections.
Yes, he was both the opponent and the referee. Yeah.
Yes. Other questions?
Right behind you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not quite sure how this question is going to come out, but I've been thinking about this a lot recently, where there's a lot of emphasis on history and reclaiming history and family history, racial history, but political history, etc. But being a person who's a recent immigrant and like first generation American and also growing up transnational, I feel as though I don't have a history in the United States, and I also don't have a history in Korea. And I also feel such a disconnect from my direct and extended family because of this extremely different experience that I had growing up. So when I hear talks about like reclaiming history and like the power of history, I often feel very very hopeless. Like I don't know what to do. Like so I was wondering if you had any advice for people like me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hope you want to take that one.
Me?
Oh, yeah.
Points to me. Yeah. Well, I feel similarly in terms of, or I felt similarly growing up. While I was even thinking about this presentation, this talk, I was thinking about how to situate myself as someone whose history, whose family history, history before me in the United States, doesn't exist or can't be traced, right? Whether or not I have ancestors who were enslaved from the African continent brought to the United States, probably, but I don't know. And then also thinking of the flip side, thinking about diaspora, thinking about transnationalism. So I'm not, so like I'm saying, I'm just not rooted in a Black American or an American tradition in terms of the way I was raised by my family. But at the same time, I've been to, my mother's from Angola, I've been to Angola. My father's from Cape Verde, I've been to Cape Verde. And I don't feel like the people there. Like I feel dispersed, and not dispersed in the way that enslaved Africans were dispersed throughout the 400 years from the 1500s to the 1800s, but dispersed and displaced in the sense that I don't feel the same. I don't feel a sense of whether or not like nationhood exists, but I don't feel a sense of a necessary community that is easily fostered. I don't speak the language. I don't speak Portuguese fluently. And so belonging is also tricky for me, and I guess when I think about transnational histories, when I think about imperialist histories, it is a way to kind of piece together the history that has been ripped from my family, that has been ripped from me as a person growing up in the U.S. Growing up in a U.S. nation state, actually, that is the reason why my family experiences so much poverty, and beyond my family, but the people of my family's birth experience so much poverty. That the bombs in Angola that were dropped by the Portuguese terrorist empire said made in the USA on them because they forgot to rip off the stickers before they sent them through NATO to Portugal. And so that doesn't necessarily give me a sense of like belonging, but it gives me a sense of purpose, I think. And it gives me a sense of like reckoning with that history of dispersal, a reckoning of a history with imperialism that I can find personally, but is not like, I don't think that restructures, my past history or anything. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But that's me thinking out loud. And I guess why I focus on transnationalism as opposed to nation-state bound histories, because I think nation-state bound histories are often just not correct. Also, so I feel lucky not to feel bounded to the nation-state and bounded to the United States, or bounded to the nation-state of Angola and bounded to the nation-state of Cape Verde. I also feel grateful for that because those are also constructions that like blind a shared sense of humanity across race, across nation, across class.
I mean, you got to clap on that. I can't follow that up. I feel bad. You feel hopeless and cynical. I've heard that before with students of just not really feeling a part of this nation, or not interested in the history, in learning about the history of this country. Part of it is there's this trauma in reading history. There is, I mean, it is an emotional experience when you're trying to reclaim history, and you hear these very, in a lot of ways, you got to kind of achieve a balance of what you're reclaiming. You're claiming the pain and the suffering and the oppression, but then there's that other part of the resilience and the resistance and things that make you feel a little bit more positive instead of just kind of, I remember in grad school and taking a slavery class, and it was like, get me to the bar, man, like after, a class, because it's so depressing on the nature of the violence and the dehumanization and things like that. But you're not, I wouldn't say, history is important, so don't give up. I do think America's a melting pot in the way that you do have a history, right? There is a historical kind of connection here to your story, I bet, that somehow speaks to that, just because of what America represents, excuse me. But the cynicism, I think, is our moment now. The idea that we're helpless. We have so much access to information, and we're learning about all these things that are happening around the world so quickly in real time that it becomes overwhelming. It becomes paralyzing, and you just really don't know what to do other than maybe tweet something or or try to live your life, not trying to be mindful of how politics are kind of shaping our experiences. But I think achieving that balance in history, like Desmond said, the idea of thinking about being part of the world, as opposed to being part of a nation, because we are moving in this sort of transnational moment where we're so interconnected, and where people belong is in maybe multiple spaces, not just one. And so that makes your story very unique too, particularly.
I would just say, I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I would say that as somebody who is a person in the world, as Desmond and Seth are saying, reading about people in the world who probably have a similar, albeit not exactly the same, story, feeling as you have. This is where reading and studying things can often give you a sense that your story is unique to you, but it might not be unique to the world and the story, all the stories that exist in terms of the complicated moment that we're in. And that's one of the beauties of being able to be somebody who, or to have a space, carve out a space where you can do that reading and studying of what has come before you, right? Even if it's not exactly precisely your story, this is the story often of people of a longer trajectory than we would think, of people having this in-between feeling, this idea of being transnational, this idea of being not particularly being connected to a nation state, but being connected to the world. Other questions? Last question.
Unless there's a student who wants to ask the last question. But I can't help posing this as the university chaplain. I've noticed that, we're talking about Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose activism was very much steeped in his religious identity, his language, the style of his speech was very much informed by his Christian identity. And we mentioned Malcolm X and his deep links to Islam and the inspiration and groundedness he found there. So I'm just curious if there's a way in which does religion or spirituality intersect for you personally in the work you do or in the scholarship and study that you've done? Where does that come in for you?
Marxist, I don't know. He was dealing with Marxists, I was saying, so I don't know. Religious spirituality. I'll go real quick. I do talk about Malcolm X, but I was really interested in Malcolm X as after he left the Nation of Islam, so the 64, 65, the last year and a half. Even though he went into a kind of Sunni Islam, I was looking at more of his secularist politics, and so not so much about the kind of shift from into Sunni Islam and that impact on him. Although kind of doing research about his travels and the pilgrimage and all these things are very important, and it did impact the ways in which he tried to organize after he left the NOI and tried to recruit people, and his appeal in the ways in which he was talking about spirituality, but then specifically in the ways he was recruiting African Americans into Sunni Islam after particularly taking guys away from the Nation of Islam. But for me, I'm trying to think about, not necessarily in my research where spirituality becomes a thing for me as part of a research question, but in my experience with organizing, being exposed to the South and what was happening with civil rights, particularly in the role of Christianity. That had obviously a big role for me because of the ways in which it brought people together across race, the ways in which it added this other added element on trying to understand the success of these movements, stuff that you don't necessarily factor in, and how those played a role. But at the same time, I think a lot of it is a personal decision. I grew up in an atheist family. These weren't questions that I was considering at the time. When I got to Tufts, I was really, when you follow that sort of black radical tradition path, you are getting exposed to people who are questioning religion, and particularly the traditional religions. And so that's the type of stuff that I was gravitating towards.
For me, on a personal level, I think on a personal level, certainly my faith has played a role in my very first conceptions of what justice meant. So whether, like as a teenager, thinking about like racial justice, economic justice, those were my first experiences, at least the faith that I grew up with, being Baptist Christian, was how I first investigated this idea of justice. And I think that provided like the initial lens for how because it was such a formative part of my life growing up, really gave me the lens to investigate all types of justice and equity issues moving forward. Yeah, and I think particularly when I think about it in like an intersectional way, I often reflect on like many of the stories of Jesus, about the way he investigated many of these issues and really approached it from like an intersectional justice way. Those were things I did not know when I was 15, but am learning and continuing to learn ever since. In the work that I do across the South, like the church is the main structure for like organizing and one of the main structures for really like empowering communities. So when we were going into communities and trying to find people who had experienced issues voting, find people who were just straight up disenfranchised, it was who are the pastors who we know in the area, what are the church networks, like the AME church is very big. They have 500 churches across the state of Georgia. And so like really realizing the role that the church plays in advocating for people, and in very real ways, like advocating for the poor, advocating for the disenfranchised. Like the church actually does that in many ways, at least, and there are also critiques of the church. So let me also put that out there. I'm not trying to say that that's necessarily the case in every situation or every church or every institution. I'm not saying that by any means, and I think we should be critical in many ways of the quote-unquote church. But certainly it does serve a real purpose in people's lives and a real infrastructure for supporting communities that far too often go unseen, unheard, and that otherwise may not have like another access point into. It is an access point into this work, and it is a communication channel into this work through a trusted institution. Mm-hmm. So it serves a huge purpose. You would not be involved in movements, politics, activism, organizing in the South and not immediately be like, who is the pastor in that area? Right.
And yeah, I mean, as Professor Mark said, I was exposed to the Marxist tradition through my family history. So I have some family members who are like committed Marxists and don't believe in Christianity. But at the same time, I was raised by my mother and father are both Catholic, but very casually Catholic. Like we only went to mass if something happened, not Christmas, like something that's not annual. So I grew up Catholic, and I grew up Catholic on both sides of my family because of Portuguese colonization. So there's also a learned hostility to that when I do research colonialism, when I do research anti-colonialism. I also have a learned hostility to the Christian faith, or not to the Christian faith, but to how Christianity and Catholicism has been used in the history that I see as my history, that I see as the history of the African continent, the third world in general. At the same time, I have a deep reverence for Black liberation theologists like Martin Luther King, like James Cone, like Albert Clige, even beyond the United States, like Jean Aristide in Haiti, who've used Christianity and used the life and teachings of Jesus Christ to be anti-colonial, to advocate for the poor, which is the original mission of Christianity, of course, as we know. At the same time, when it comes to my research, and when it comes to the trajectory of African decolonization, there is no decolonization project without the intense support of progressive elements of the Christian community in the United States, of religious organizations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In Angola specifically, the first Angolans to come to the United States to study in scholarship, who were part of the MPLA in the early 1960s, did so through Methodist scholarships. The MPLA itself is primarily a Methodist organization. The first president was a Methodist. I interviewed, actually, this past summer, I did research in Angola where I interviewed the United Nations ambassador, permanent ambassador of Angola. And he came to the United States on a scholarship from Methodists, or from the Methodist Church, and was in conversation. I think he had an internship, he told me, in the SCLC law offices, where he worked with Andrew Young, John Lewis. He said he was like in the building, like across from Martin Luther King, so he saw him, but he never talked to him. So there's that tradition, which is very important. And even all like the Black Marxists, the Black liberation organizations in the 1970s got a lot of funding from organizations like IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organizing. So without those ties, they don't even have any money to embark on the programming that they're doing. So there's a clear role of not only the spiritual aspects of Christianity, and of the church in general, religion. We can also talk about the Nation of Islam, but just the organizational importance. At the same time, also my research and in my personal life, I've been trying to reconcile, and this is kind of going back to like the Black socialist tradition of this kind of aversion, this learned aversion, which appears in many circles, of advocating for modernity and being very anti what people call tribal. Anti-tribalism was a huge point of pride for Angolan nationalists in the MPLA in the 1970s, where they very much looked down upon the ontological, the traditions of African people, the habits, beliefs, metaphysics of African people for the past 300 years, and strive to be modern, essentially in the vein of what Europe had become or what Europe wanted to be. And I felt that in my own personal life as well. So my mother was born to an Angolan woman, and a Portuguese, her father was a Portuguese prison guard actually in Angola. And so she grew up mixed race, was adopted by a very modern, high-minded family, which became guerrillas in the national struggle. But she also grew up very much looking down upon indigenous practices in Angola, looking down upon indigenous spiritual practices, but also the linguistic practices. And I remember when I was in Angola this past summer, I was with my aunt, and we were actually driving back from the National Slavery Museum in Angola, like around the same week as the 1619 stuff was happening, which is Angola's where the enslaved Africans were taken from and brought to the Americas in 1619, the 400th anniversary last year. And I passed by, we were driving by these imbondeiro trees, which are very sacred trees in a lot of African religions. And I saw these people doing what appeared to me as a ceremony around them, and I like pointed out to my aunt. Like it's something, I mean, I've always wanted to be more in touch with my Africanity, you know, being like the son of Africans, being a displaced African. And I mentioned it to my aunt, something that I thought was very cool. And she was like, oh, you should stay away from them. Like that's voodoo, that's witchcraft, that's bad. And it's very serious there. A lot of people look down on voodoo and witchcraft and these things that are considered anti-modern very intensely. Which is all to say that I'm grappling with trying to reclaim spirituality for myself while also internalizing and learning from the traditions of Black liberation theologists like Martin Luther King, who preach on the life of Jesus Christ. So kind of trying to reach a synthesis between the past, the present, and the future, in terms of all the different levels of spirituality that African people have been exposed to in the past 400 years.
Thank you very much. I want to give everybody a hand. This was wonderful, and thank you so much for your stories and your talk, and thank you. That is, I think we're concluding for today, but I know we have one final speaker who's going to wrap up the program for today. So thank you to our speakers again. Give them a hand. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. I'm Nandi Bino. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion here, and I just, again, want to thank everyone for first coming and also for our panelists and organizers for putting on a really great event. Thanks for giving your time, everyone. This is really important. So one of the things, what does closing remarks look like? I was sort of reflecting on this theme and this topic, and what I kept coming back to was the idea of storytelling and community action, right? When we think about what it means to be on the right side of revolution, we have to be grounded in the historical context, whatever that means for us, right? And also, how do we sort of move that storytelling, those individual stories and those collective stories, into community action? and how do we individually sort of play our part in the bigger movements. That's what I have. You know, it's something that we all grapple with. I think one of the things that I thought about was in 2016, in November, I was bopping around, thinking deep thoughts, and I came across a conversation with Professor Greenwich and Professor Fields, and they, for me, when I was grappling with what we were doing in that November, they grounded it in a U.S. historical context, and I'm not from the U.S., and I didn't have that. So for me, it centered me in my motion towards action, because I felt like even if this wasn't necessarily my personal history, I had people that I could draw on, and I had historians who knew what they were doing, and who I could look to for guidance. So I feel really like we can't make this motion without the community of people around us, the community of people in this room. And so I just invite you to think about what that looks like now and moving forward. And like for students taking the time at Tufts to build the language to go do the things, as our panelists all said much more eloquently than I just did. So thank you again all for your time, and have a good night.